A week of very heavy contemplation. I promise you things will lighten up from 12 when we indulge in our weekly ventures into the unknown on Mystery Hour. Before that, continue the conversation about yesterday's debate and the broader picture described by it. I'm joined now by the Scottish National Party's Alex Salmond, former First Minister of Scotland, of course, a veteran parliamentarian as well. So I'll begin, actually, Alex, by asking you whether or not...
That's the first time anybody's ever called me that. Veteran, don't call me that. Veteran parliamentarian. Well, experienced.
If you'd reached the end of my question, you'd understand, OK, a very experienced parliamentarian, because I wonder how unprecedented yesterday's events were or were not.
Well, I've been through quite a few war debates. It wasn't a bad debate, as debates go. Interestingly, the vote was almost identical to the vote in 2003, the numbers in the Iraq War. Of course, if you held that vote again, you get an entirely different result.
Yes.
But almost to the vote, the majority was almost identical to Blair's majority back in 2003. I was in that debate as well.
People forget, well, there you go, veteran. People forget how many Labour MPs voted against, don't they?
Yeah, well, it's different. I mean, last time, if you remember, it was a Labour Prime Minister, Blair, with a Labour rebellion against him, and the Tory frontbench and most of the Tories supporting the war. This time, of course, it's a Tory Prime Minister with a small Tory rebellion, being opposed by, well, as far as you can tell, officially by the Labour Party, with a large Labour rebellion against their own party. So, yeah, I mean, politics gets a bit complicated. But the only consistent theme is the SNP votes against war.
Always.
No, not always. We supported the first Gulf War because there was a UN mandate, limited objectives, and a chance of success. I always think, I'm not a pacifist, so you don't get too queasy about things. But if you're having a war and you want to make it just, there has to be a realisable objective. Because unless you have a realisable objective, you've got the difficulty that can go on forever, as, for example, Afghanistan and Iraq went on forever.
And Libya continues to...
Well, Libya is a good example. I mean, people talk about past mistakes. The Prime Minister keeps saying, we mustn't be hidebound by past mistakes. Well, let's talk about recent mistakes. 2 years ago, he wanted to bomb the other side in Syria. And then, of course, the Libyan bombing of 2011. Well, what's happened there? We've spent 13 times as much bombing Libya as trying to reconstruct it. The result is a failed state, a terrorist hive, incidentally. I mean, the UK citizens who were massacred in Tunisia, as far as you can tell, the country linked to that is not Syria, but Libya, the failed state where terrorists can train. And one of the reasons for that is we spent so little reconstructing the country and so much bombing it.
I guess people listening will be confused as to, if you can see things so clearly, what it is you think David Cameron is up to. I mean, what if it is not the case that there's an end game in sight, if it is not the case that the cause is as just as it was for Gulf War I, if it is not the case that this is, posing a clear and present danger to Britain, then what's the Prime Minister doing? OK,
right. I mean, well, listen, for a start, nobody goes to war for what they claim are base motives. Every time I've heard somebody, every Prime Minister I've heard saying we have to go to war, it's always for the best, the noblest, the highest of reasons. Nobody ever says I'm going to war for because I'm trying to be part of the party, part of the game. But I thought the mask slipped a couple of times yesterday. A number of Tory MPs more or less said, look, it's shameful that we're not part of this big game that's being played out. We should be at the party. We are a big country, Britain. We should be in there. And that I thought was quite revealing. And the second thing where the mask
that's vanity you're describing.
Yeah, well, that's big power vanity. That's wanting to be back in the imperial days when a few gunboats. Now it's some tornadoes and typhoons. But I thought the mask really slipped with the terrorist sympathiser comment. Because that shows exactly that a large part of the Prime Minister's thinking is to increase the divisions within the Labour Party.
It worked, though, didn't it?
Yeah, it worked. But, of course, you might hope that a Prime Minister taking a country to war would be interested in uniting the country, not dividing the opposition. So he might succeed and has succeeded in dividing the Labour Party, but he's failed to unite the country.
Do you think he should have apologised? Because some of your colleagues on the SNP benches were calling for an apology.
Yeah, I did.
Well, of course you did.
Straight to his face. Of course he should have apologised. But, what's it? The old Tory adage, never apologise, never explain. That's the
not just the Tories.
Motto. We never apologise, we never explain.
Do you understand why some people watching felt that was... I mean, you could almost, if you were to cast the Prime Minister in a very Machiavellian role, you could almost say that you walked right into his trap by insisting that he apologised for some comments that he made last night and drawing attention away from the broader debate about whether or not these bombs should be dropped.
No, I think at that stage in the debate, that comment was costing him Labour votes. and obviously, if we're looking for the Machiavellian politics, then clearly. I'm offended when you call Jeremy Corbyn a terrorist sympathiser, because I don't think he is.
Sure.
I think he is a decent man.
It wasn't just him; it was Jeremy Corbyn and a bunch of. So it was kind of everybody.
It was pretty all-encompassing. But people who are not in the Tory party are by definition terrorist sympathisers, or in danger of being seen as that. And I'm sure that's the weapon that Tories intend to use against Labour. Labour is soft on security, soft on terrorism, soft on this, soft on that, soft on the next thing. But it wasn't. It was important to get that the Prime Minister nailed on that, because a lot of the wavering Labour MPs, obviously, any self-respecting Labour member of Parliament should rally to his leader's or her leader's cause when that person is called a terrorist sympathiser. You might think that's a kind of base loyalty. Obviously, it doesn't transfer to Hilary Benn. Great speech and all that. There's a great speech, and it was a great speech. From somebody who's coming to the aid of a Tory Prime Minister, taking the country to war, and doesn't mind all that much, or doesn't see the importance of his leader being described as a terrorist sympathiser. Now, you can call that a great speech, but there's not much loyalty there.
Was that a game changer? Because you mentioned the wavering Labour voters.
I think that probably changed 15, 20 Labour votes.
Quite a lot.
Yeah, I think, that's my judgment. I mean, the Telegraph yesterday, who are very close to these things in the Tory party, forecast a majority 170. My feeling was, as the debate went on, and particularly the inability to answer what one Tory memorably described as the bogus battalions of the 70,000 mythical troops, I thought things were swaying, and the Benn speech certainly rallied the war faction of the Labour Party to the Prime Minister's cause.
Why? What buttons did he push that no one else had managed to push?
Well, firstly, he was batting a good wicket, right? He's got a silent Labour Party behind him and an adoring Tory party in front of him. In contrast, Jeremy Corbyn gets up, after 5 seconds, he's got 10 Tory MPs baiting him. Now, of course, he should be able to handle that,
of course.
But nonetheless, it's a lot easier to speak to an adoring room in front of you and people behind you. So he had a good scene for it. But the button he pressed, obviously, was appealing to Labour's internationalism, the United Nations, therefore, it's not about the Tory party, it's about our history of the Spanish Civil War. And so he appealed to a lot of traditional Labour buttons. But I'll tell you this, his father, whose speech I heard in the Iraq debate all these years ago, and I was sitting virtually in the same place, his father would be burling in his grave hearing a speech in favour of a Tory Prime Minister wanting to take the country to war. And that's just a reality.
In fact, the speech, I think the speech you refer to, has gone a little bit viral on social media, and there's a certain bearded Jeremy Corbyn sitting a couple of seats to his right behind him. So they used to sit very much in the same corner of the House, didn't they?
I'll tell you something, if, as probably Tony Benn was called a terrorist sympathiser at some point by the Tories, and Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't have taken that attack on Tony Benn.
Alex Salmond, I should have added, of course, that you hold the Foreign Affairs brief for the Scottish National Party. Can you stay with us a little longer? I'm going to go to the news, because I'm drawn particularly to the fact that these aircraft that will be undertaking these campaigns are based in Scotland, where 57 of the 59 members of Parliament voted against the bombing. So there's a lot of other elements that are particularly interesting to us via you. We'll do that after this. Alex Salmond, the SNP's Foreign Affairs spokesman, is with me. Just to clarify one thing a few people have noticed. Hilary Benn was pretty vociferous in his calls for David Cameron to apologise for the terrorist sympathisers' comments when he wasn't speaking. I mean, the pictures of him on the television were clear to see. He was very much joining in those responses when looking directly at the Prime Minister and the Chancellor.
I don't doubt that. That's not the point I was making. The point I was making was he then, as it were, put that to one side and came to the Prime Minister's aid. I don't think any self-respecting political party, I don't care what the political divisions are, takes a situation when their leader is described as a terrorist sympathiser unjustly by the Prime Minister and says, OK, we want an apology there, but now it's business as usual. I don't take that.
OK. We've been wondering earlier why the decision to change gear, albeit the obvious observation about the Iraqi government asking for help and the Syrian government not having done so, but the change of gear from effectively a bombing campaign already underway being extended to the west by about 100 miles has garnered so much more attention and so much more debate, so much more division, so much more rancour than the original decision to start the campaign in the first place. Well, I mean, if you were trying to explain that to a student of politics and they were saying, well, hang on, it started in September and there were only 39 Labour people, there was hardly anyone voted against it, and now it's the biggest story in town for the best part of a month.
I think people suspect, those who oppose, suspect the Prime Minister's motives. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that David Cameron has wanted to do this for some time. It wasn't just the outrage in Paris, the slaughter of British citizens in Tunisia. He's wanted to do this for some considerable time, almost itching to, because 2 years ago when he wanted to bomb Assad, he got turned over. Now, if you look at the Cameron CV, then what are the blots in the copybook? Well, one blot in the copybook is he's the first Prime Minister to ask for a mandate to go to war and get turned over in the attempt to bomb Assad. So there's a lot of evidence that he and the Defence Secretary Fallon and the Foreign Secretary Hammond, they've been itching to overturn that reversal of 2 years ago, and circumstances allowed them to bring it to a head now. So there's a lot of suspicion about motives. And the second argument, one which was really well expressed by a number of dissident Tory MPs like David Davis yesterday, is to say, look, it's not the same situation. In Iraq, there are at least troops on the ground. And in the case of the Iraqi government, they may not be the best troops. In the case of the Peshmerga, the Kurdish forces, they are very, very good troops, very motivated troops, but they're actually on the ground. So there is the combination which can make an air campaign successful, which is power from the air and troops on the ground. In Syria, there are not any reliable ground forces that you'd want to, well, not just invite home to tea, that you could rely on in a battle to be on your side in 10 minutes' time.
So, I mean, this will be a personal opinion rather than a political one, Alex Salmond. Is David Cameron just sort of crossing his fingers then, in your opinion, when he talks about 70,000 moderates, or is he deluding himself?
I think that's nonsense. I think, well, I mean, I take it there are 70,000 probably fighters in Syria who are not affiliated to Daesh and are probably not directly affiliated to Al-Qaeda, although that's much more debatable because certainly there are Islamists among them. But they're not in that part of the country. They're not around Raqqa. They're hundreds, if not even 1,000 miles away. And the idea that they're all going to sort of merrily go, off to Dublin in the Green, they're all going to say, right, let's all march in Raqqa, that's for the birds. And of course, they're now withdrawing from that. I mean, by the time we got to the end of the debate, it was, well, of course, that's not going to happen. Philip Hammond was saying it's not going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. In several years' time, and perhaps the conditions will allow for this moderate army to be assembled. And most people would argue that you kind of wait for the moderate army to be assembled, and then if the United Nations approve and if you have the sort of coalition that can achieve war aims at that stage, is when you agree to be part of an international coalition.
So what do you think the red button was then? Was it the Paris attack?
I think it was opportunity. I think it was the fact that political circumstances, the tragedy, the massacre, the atrocity in Paris allowed the position to be presented. Now, no Tory Prime Minister is going to be batting on a sticky wicket going to war, incidentally. That's pretty home ground for a Tory Prime Minister. No Tory Prime Minister is going to look bad leading a war faction. I mean, as Margaret Thatcher demonstrated back in the 1980s. So it's pretty home ground for a Tory Prime Minister. Much more difficult ground for a Labour Prime Minister. But of course, Blair, to our great cost, pulled it off with great aplomb.
Well, yes, he did indeed. Opposed, of course, by the Scottish National Party as well at the time. The 59 votes against, and yet the planes are based in Scotland. I don't know if this will strike you as a horribly southern perspective, but we are actually, despite your best efforts, we are still a united kingdom. So why does it matter where the planes are?
Well, firstly, that's true. We didn't win the referendum. We won the election, but we didn't win the referendum. So that's a reality. Secondly, of course, when you get into conflict, whatever your views, you have to support your servicemen and women. They're entitled to that support and get it. But I think it is politically significant that out of Scotland's 59 MPs, 57 voted against the airstrikes in Syria. I mean, it's politically significant, as a range of things are politically significant, of two diverging views. Are the two diverging views of a country, or is it of the MPs who represent the country? I'm not so sure that there is a mass reservoir of people in England who are thirsting for military action. I just think England is rather badly represented by its members of Parliament.
Is Jeremy Corbyn closer to the Scottish National Party than he is to most of his own parliamentary Labour Party?
On this issue, yes.
What about on other issues?
A number of things I don't agree with Jeremy Corbyn on, but there are a number of things I do agree with him on. I mean, I suppose I've been when I've been an MP, and he's been an MP a long time, like I have. Then I've been in the lobby more often with him than against him. That's certainly true. We don't agree on everything, but there are a range of things we do agree on.
Is from your perspective, there'll be a degree of self-interest, of course, in seeing the Labour Party fall apart, because it shores up your position. It strengthens even further your party's position north of the Scottish border, doesn't it? But
I don't want to sound complacent on behalf of Nicola Sturgeon, but I'm not certain Nicola Sturgeon needs the Labour Party to fall apart. I mean, she's been doing a pretty good job dismantling it by herself. And I would say, I mean, you can check the record, I haven't said anything over the last 2 weeks unhelpful to the Labour Party about its divisions, because I reckon the issue of war and peace, bombing or not bombing, was too important to be playing party games.
You've been dancing on a grave that's still being dug.
Well, that's correct, and of course I may well say things now because I bitterly disagree with the Labour MPs who came to David Cameron's aid. And also, my general feeling about the Labour Party, and this is as an observer, is that by and large, and I'm not pointing to Hilary Benn or MD in particular, but by and large, the Blairite, right-wing Labour MPs have tended to be, over a period of time, the most disloyal, the most untrustworthy, and the most career-motivated of any group of members of Parliament I've ever seen, apart from the higher echelons of the Conservative Party.
It depends how you define disloyal. Jeremy Corbyn voted against the whip over 500 times as a backbencher.
Yes, and
that's not loyalty personified.
And therefore, that is a difficulty for him as a leader of a political party. There's no doubt about that, and that's going to be used against him, and was used against him during the leadership campaign.
And will be used
On the
again.
other hand, he ended up with a huge mandate.
Hang on, I just want to pull you back to that bitterness that you feel towards the MPs who came down. The word you just described. Do you think you are as bitter as the activists who are now clamouring, I think, rather than merely calling for deselection of Labour MPs?
Well, that's two things. One, I deprecate abuse of any kind towards MPs or anyone else.
You just said that Hilary Benn's dad would be turning in his grave.
That's not abuse.
Is it not?
Oh, no, I mean, that's a fair comment.
It's a little ad hominem, though.
A little ad hominem. No, I think it's a fair comment about the contrast between the two Bens that I've seen in the House of Commons. I don't think that's ad hominem at all, and it certainly doesn't, in my book, constitute
it's not a political
abuse
point,
of any kind.
It's a personal point.
Yeah, this is politics. I think that's a fair political comment.
Okay.
To contrast the views of the father and the son, but particularly what interests me is the idea of in that situation. Incidentally, if you think that's difficult, you should have a look at what Dennis Skinner is saying about it today.
Yes, fair point. So the notion of deselection, because that is precisely the bitterness you've just described, taken to its natural conclusion.
Right, okay. Firstly, there shouldn't be abuse, internet or elsewhere. And I don't regard what I say about these people as abuse. I don't think it is at all. I think it's fair political comment. But there shouldn't be abuse, and we know what it is, and everybody sees it in the social media, and we should deprecate it. Political party memberships are entitled to select their candidate. Every SNP MP has to go in front of a vote of his or her constituency party. So I don't think people should be prevented from standing, incidentally. I don't think they should be, there should be a kind of a red spot or a black spot it would be and say, right, you're out. I don't think that should happen. I think people should be allowed, but every member of Parliament should be reselected by a vote of every single member of their party, because they are their candidate in that constituency, and it should be a one member, one vote in the constituency. I believe that we've done it for years and years. It's never caused me any difficulty, so why should it cause anybody else? And incidentally, the idea that MPs are such wimps that, I disagree, as I've just said, with the Labour MPs coming to the aid of a Tory Prime Minister on a very, very weak case for war. I disagree with that very, very strongly indeed. But listen, I think MPs should vote with their conscience, and they shouldn't be bullied or cowed by anyone. And to be fair, I actually know very few MPs who are in that position. My difficulty with what's happening in the Labour Party, and it was reflected in a number of speeches yesterday, we were discussing bombing or no bombing. A lot of Labour speeches yesterday, if you look at them, had a subtext about the Labour Party. And I think, we should really, yesterday we should have been concentrating wholly on the issue.
Final question then. Could it be curtains, do you think, for the Labour Party in the way that you've known it all your life?
I don't think that political parties die out that easily. And having said that, the Liberals are doing a pretty good job, I'd have thought. But I don't think political parties do. And I think there'll always be a political party representing that position in politics. I mean, I don't regard the Labour Party's current position as extreme. I don't agree with Jeremy Corbyn on a range of issues, as I've said, but I don't regard that as an extremist party in political terms. And there's always going to be a party which represents the centre-left, left-centre of politics. Whether it's the Labour Party in its current form or another one, there'll always be a party which has to represent that spectrum in politics. The difficulty I think people, particularly in England, face now is that with the state of the Labour Party, there's very few people would vote against or bet against. I think a lot of folk will vote against it, hopefully, but they will bet against the Tories being odds on for another election victory. However, having said that, the Icarus and the sins of pride affect lots of people, no doubt including myself. But I'll tell you what, any pride that I've seen in politics doesn't come close to the higher echelons of the Conservative Party and their sense of entitlement. And as George Osborne has been demonstrating in recent weeks, pride can come before a fall.
Indeed it can. Go on then, before you go, what's the closest you've ever flown to the sun?
I've been up there a few times. I think politics you tend to. In Scotland we've got a good phrase for it. Incidentally, we don't say arrogant or conceited. We say they've got a good conceit themselves. So occasionally I've been flying a wee bit close to the sun with a good conceit myself.
Not answering the question, but charming nonetheless. Alex Salmond, many thanks indeed.
Yes, I'm going to vote with the government and with the Prime Minister to support a limited and modest extension of what we're doing in Iraq and Syria. And the reasons are, I'm going to do that, Colin.